Okay. You ready? Let's do this. You're listening to Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. This is the podcast that delves deep into the outdoors, will inspire, inform, and get you stoked to explore. And I'm your host, David Webb. Welcome to episode 39 of Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. I'm David Webb. Forestry. What do you think of when you hear this word? Maybe it conjures up logging and clearcuts. Maybe you think of economic drivers and wood products and heritage. Maybe you're not 100% sure. But very likely, if you're listening to this podcast or you read our magazine, you spend a lot of time in the forest. I know I do. Forests have deep social and cultural value to us. But they also supply the materials that build our houses and even the paper on which Explore magazine is printed. How do we reconcile this? Or more specifically, how does Canada's forestry industry reconcile the needs of all of Canada to ensure we have healthy forests now and into the future? Well, today my guest is Jeff Mycock, Chief Forester Canada with West Fraser. Jeff has more than 30 years of forestry experience, and we're going to dig deep and ask the tough questions about how our forests are managed to the benefit of Canada and the planet. You may be surprised at some of his answers. Are you ready? All right. Stay tuned for Jeff Mycock. All right, Jeff, welcome to Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. How are you doing today?
I am doing well, thank you.
That is great to hear. Great to hear. I'd like to just take a minute if you could introduce yourself to our listeners. Who are you? Where are you from? And what do you do?
My name's Jeff Mycock. I'm the Chief Forester Canada with West Fraser, based in Quesnel, British Columbia. I'm a registered professional forester and been working in forestry now for 31 years in British Columbia. And my current role, I'm involved in projects in Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario, as well as British Columbia.
Now, during your introduction there, you said forestry, you said forester. How is forestry defined? What do you want Canadians to think about when they hear the word forestry?
It's a good question. A lot of people have difficulty actually relating to forestry and the profession of forestry and what we do, but essentially, it's a combining of an art and a science. There's a lot of science involved. To manage forests and forest ecosystems essentially in a sustainable way. And that's really to, maintain or enhance the long-term health of our forests, to provide for some key values. Mainly, you can put those values into four buckets: environmental, social, economic, and cultural, today and for future generations.
I'd love to dig into those four buckets a little bit. The environmental, social, cultural, and economic. How is that balanced?
I think I would say that's where the art comes into play. Is in really as a forester, as a professional forester, we're taking direction from the landowner, which is in most cases the public in British Columbia and Canada overall. And,
you mean Crown land?
Yeah.
Is that what you're...
So, we're looking for direction through legislation, through land use plans, through other public processes, through engagement with Indigenous communities to determine the best prescription that balances the sustainable capacity of those forest systems to provide for those values. So, you don't want to be in a situation where you're managing one at the cost of another. You need to be able to keep things in balance in a way that people accept and can support. And really it becomes a question of scale. So a lot of the things get measured at a landscape level, sustaining the presence of those values over time. So environmental could be things like water quality and water quantity. It could be fish or wildlife habitat values, wildlife abundance, any of those kinds of things. It could be, social, it could be recreational values. It could be, any number of other things that people rely on the forest for. Economic, of course, is just that. It's jobs, business development opportunities, and cultural. There's any number of different cultural values, but largely we think of Indigenous people and traditional cultural uses and values that they experience from the forest. So it's keeping all those things in view and trying to make sure that we're maintaining or enhancing those values through our management over time.
So you've been doing this for 31 years.
Mm-hmm.
These buckets, this balance, this art, has this evolved over time?
I think it's been in place for quite a while, but one thing I can say is, at the onset of my career, I don't think that the cultural values were as much in view as they are today. It was more the three, environmental, social, and economic were commonly spoken of. I think we've become more aware of the cultural aspects and values and learning how to manage for those as well over time. So that's definitely one evolution. We've seen things ebb and flow on the environmental. I think there's different levels of emphasis at different times depending on which government regime we're in, and we've seen that kind of go through peaks and valleys. I think there's always a high level of environmental stewardship, regardless, in my experience, and working in the profession, but people's perspectives, change over time. And I think with climate change, it's really put a lot more emphasis on environmental state of things. And, people are much more attentive to extreme weather events and floods and different things that are affecting the stability of our systems. And so there's a lot of emphasis on environmental today, I think probably more so than there has been in the past when things were maybe more benign or balanced in terms of what we might think of as normal climatic or seasonal patterns.
Right. So in a time when there were less climate events, it was maybe not boiling up to the forefront as much as it is today.
Yes. Yeah, it's very much on the forefront across several different aspects right now, for sure.
So like you said, forestry, the word, means a lot of things to a lot of people, but what do people not know about it?
When people think of forestry, I think they think of logging and they think of trees being cut down, and that's probably the first thing many people think of, even though there's much more to forestry than that. But one of the things perhaps is just to know the extent of work and planning and preparation and so on that goes into the preparation for harvest. And so when a tree is cut, that's a culmination literally of years of work that's been done prior to that point. It doesn't just happen randomly or by chance. And so it's by design and by plan. And after going through significant legal compliance with legal requirements, regulatory requirements, not just forestry legislation, but other legislation, might be Department of Fisheries and Oceans. It could be water-related legislation, any number of different acts and regulations that need to be reviewed and plans need to be approved. So that's one thing I think that's probably not a lot of people would realize, the extent of work that's done to cut a tree.
It's an interesting industry, forestry. I think the listeners of this podcast and readers of Explore magazine, we dwell in the forests. We love the forest. Nature is our lifeblood. Where at the same time, Explore, we print magazine, right? As a society, we use forest products almost every day. So when we go outside and we see a harvested forest, what do you want people to know about that when they see that?
It's important to know that it's part of a broader planning process. And there is science and technology behind those decision-making processes. When you see, clear-cut harvesting, or you think about clear-cut harvesting, it's one of many methods of harvesting, and it's a management tool. I have trouble with the word clear-cut because it implies something that isn't necessarily what you see when you go to the woods. And like often there's another modifier in there called reserves. And many of our areas that we conduct clear-cut harvest operations in have quite variable distributions of single trees and groups of trees and buffers on different features, whether it be streams or wetlands. And so you don't see a large, broad, extensive, cleared area. You do at times, but not in all cases. So it might be an overused term to describe types of harvesting. It's used where it's deemed to be ecologically appropriate. and most closely emulates a disturbance that would naturally occur, which would, typically be in an even-aged forest where the trees are, relatively similar in age. And, if a fire were to occur in that forest, you'd be starting back at, age zero with a new forest again. So you would
Right.
conduct this harvest method and then reforest and start again. But the size, the shape, the configuration of harvest areas, the amount of cleared area between reserves, the types of reserves, those are all factors that are part of, clear cut harvesting that don't get captured in the word clear cut.
It's probably used to describe everything from the common vernacular. People just think, oh, that's a clear cut, this is a clear cut, this is a clear cut. They just mean the cutting down of a tree. And it's interesting to hear that and to think that, say, if you're on flying over Vancouver Island maybe, and you can see some of the harvested forest, it's like that patchwork is not an accident.
I think another thing to consider as well is when we create a disturbance from harvesting, it's evident for many, many years. And so, if you give that example of flying over a landscape and seeing past clear cuts, you might be looking at something that happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. That may not be that, the thought or the technology or the science that informed those decisions at that point in time are different than the decision-making processes of today. So I guess when I'm answering that question, I'm thinking about today.
Right.
But there may be circumstances in the past where the same considerations didn't come to bear. We've learned as we've gone, right? And that's a key factor, is we're relatively young forestry jurisdiction, like on a global scale. We're still on our first pass harvest in many of our forests in Canada, whereas other jurisdictions like in say Finland or Sweden and places like that, they're multiple times through. So their practices and their knowledge have evolved over time, and we're still learning in some cases, but certainly there's been a lot of change from 50 years ago, say, to today.
How are forests renewed?
Planting is the most common, but it's not the only method of renewal. So depending on the system, we may do partial cutting, we could do single tree selection, small patch selection. There's a number of different systems that could be applied and are applied for natural regeneration on the site from trees that are from the site itself or adjacent to the site. But also, commonly we do a lot of planting. I think, annually in Canada, we're planting between 400 and 600 million seedlings each year. And it is a common method of reforestation, but most sites, at least in my experience, also have some degree of natural regeneration. So planting is a primary form. It ensures that we get the desired tree species back on the site, growing again promptly in a desired time frame. And then we get contributions from naturally regenerated trees from seed on site. And 10 years following planting, it's actually very difficult to walk through that young stand and say, well, that's a planted tree and that's a natural tree, because they start to blend in together. And a lot of our young forests look very much like a naturally regenerated forest. We don't have the really stringent 5 foot by 5 foot spatial arrangements and intensive tending and activities that you might see in other parts of the world. So our forests are planted, but they have many natural attributes that are maintained.
Is that mandatory, the replanting?
Yeah, so there's that is part of the law that we operate within, is there's a legal reforestation requirement that specifies, and it's driven by the ecology of the sites that we're operating on, specifies the minimum number of trees, the species of trees, the health and quality of those trees at a certain point in time. There's a bunch of parameters that have to be met in order to be relieved of that legal obligation. And so yeah, there's a lot there. It's a big deal. Silviculture is is a big part of what we do.
How do you determine which is going to be replanted or which is going to be seeded naturally, or the mix therein?
There's a combination of objectives that come into play. So, a common area where we have historically managed for natural regeneration is in lodgepole pine forests of the interior, both in BC and in Alberta. But prior to mountain pine beetle, it was common to harvest a lodgepole pine forest and then scarify the ground to promote a seedbed for natural regeneration of lodgepole pine. And it would naturally regenerate, and we might need to do some thinning depending on the densities, and away you go. So if you didn't have enough seed on site, you may plant, or you may assess after a few years and determine that you're not going to get adequate natural regeneration, and then you would plant. But it's really based on the potential for natural regeneration to successfully reforest the site. But also it could be, maybe you'll get natural regeneration, but it's an undesirable tree species or value species, or a species that's not desired for some longer term wildlife habitat objective or other values that you're trying to manage for. So you may decide to plant a species or combination of species to meet those longer term objectives. So there's a bunch of different things that influence whether or not we plant, how much we plant, and what we plant.
But what if something like a poplar, like a really fast growing species, kind of like moves in there and starts taking over the area? Like that wouldn't be what you would desire. How do you manage that?
Well, in some cases that might be what we would desire.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, again, this is another probably change over time. Historically, the non-conifer species were less desired and treated either manually or chemically. There's a variety of treatment methods have been used to reduce their composition and promote more conifers, such as maybe it's Douglas fir or hybrid white spruce or lodgepole pine. But, again, today, I think we're taking a harder look at that. We're saying, you know what, deciduous forest isn't a bad thing. Let's have more of it. And one of the considerations is ecosystem resilience and landscape diversity from a wildfire perspective. It's another consideration for wildlife habitat, for moose in particular. So we are still managing the composition of those forests, but we're, I think, more comfortable with deciduous forest in some of these areas than we have been in the past. And we're also understanding that we can have mixed forests with aspen and spruce and grow both species together. And so there's a variety you vegetation management methods to control the composition of undesirable species, but there's also economic value in aspen too, with for pulp operations or oriented strand board manufacturing, panels, stuff like that. So there's many areas where we're growing aspen, and that's what we want.
And does the management of other species besides trees come into play under your umbrella?
No, we're looking at the whole ecosystem for sure, and the sustainability of all those values. So you might have a rare plant, you might have an important medicinal plant for indigenous people's collections, and it may require a certain environment, such as shade. And so that may influence your decision to harvest or not, or you may modify your harvest to do selective harvesting, selection cutting, so you can maintain the desired environment, the required environment for that particular species to still exist. It might affect the season that you harvest. You may harvest on snowpack versus in the summer. And it may affect what you plant or if you plant. So it goes beyond managing for the trees for sure. We're looking at the whole plant community.
What is the planning that goes into this is where we're going to do it to it's done and being replanted? How long does this take?
This is really the essence of sustainable forest management and sustainable forest management planning. So that process, essentially from the time that planting starts to the time that you may actually be cutting a tree, I would say on average is at least 2 years to the point where you're, at that reforestation stage. Typically that could be as early as, a year post harvesting, 1 to 2 years typically. And so from the time you look at a site and you're planning what you're going to do to the time you're reforesting it again is inside of, it's probably, let's call it 2 to 4 years. That planning process, so there's a hierarchy of plans that occur. I think in most of the provinces, we've got land use planning processes, which are broad, high level. They indicate which areas are available for forestry. One thing of note is 95% of Canada's forests are on public land, so they're regulated by sustainable forest management processes. But less than half of those forests are actually available to practice forestry, and less than 1% of that land base is actually harvested annually. So that just kind of helps maybe put things in context a little bit. That really comes down through that land use planning process and is reflected in that. So you get areas that are set aside for parks and protected areas and other areas that are for wildlife, etc. That there is no forestry permitted for whatever those reasons might be.
And that takes that down to the half. That's what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
The parks, protected areas, all the different regions that are just off limits.
Yeah.
That cuts out about half right there.
If I look at BC, about 37 to 40% of our forest land base is available for forestry. And it's similar in Canada. I think it's about 45% of Canada's forests are available for forestry and 55% is not available. And so, but even on that land base that is available for forestry, we have to manage for biodiversity. We have to manage those other values, like I mentioned, water quality and quantity. We've got to manage for wildlife habitat values and thinking about winter ranges for, species like mule deer and habitat requirements for moose, for caribou, the list goes on. So then, you take the information from the land use plan, and then we have to do a sustainable forest management plan. It could be, depending which province you're in, it could be a forest stewardship plan. It could be called a forest management plan. And then inside of that, there's an operating plan. Each plan is related to, they're kind of nested almost, if you will. And by the time you get to the design of where you're going to build roads and create access and design harvest areas, they're linked to and fit within that broader planning framework and should reflect a sustainable forest management model.
And that takes it down to that 1%.
Yeah, well, it's on an annual basis. If you think, you operate over 100-year time frame, and by the time you get to the end of the 100-year time frame, you've got a mature forest, you start again. So let's say it's 1% per year that you're cutting of that available forest land base. The last step within there are site level plans, which are looking very specifically at, it could be archaeological presence. There's archaeological surveys, there's cultural assessment, site assessment.
Right.
There's classification of soils, classification of water bodies, and very site-specific information that's kind of the last layer in the planning.
What you just said there about the 1% per year, probably understanding that you've very much simplified it, but 1% per year on a 100-year time frame, and then starting over again because you've had 100 years for those forests to regenerate. What does it feel like to be involved in that multi-generational forward-thinking way? I mean, it must be pretty interesting to have a job to think that some of the work that you're doing is going to be recognized and realized by people who aren't even born yet. Yeah. How does that make you feel?
Responsible.
Yeah.
There's a lot of responsibility, and but at the same time, every decision that we make it goes beyond today. It goes beyond now. It's long term. It forces you to think long term, and what we're doing is creating legacy, and hopefully it's positive legacy. That's what we're endeavoring to do. in addition to my role with West Fraser, I also operate two woodlot licenses in British Columbia, and I'm a tenure holder and small business owner. Your
Hmm.
mortality comes into view when you're managing those land bases. They're fixed
Yeah.
area based tenures. Prior to my management of these tenures, other folks had them for about 30 years. Both of them are similar. You want to continue the legacy that they've started, try and build on it, try and improve where you see the opportunity to do so. But you want to leave something for the next generation. And
Hmm.
that's really, again, that's part of the art of forestry. And no one wants to go and ruin what's there today. We have a stewardship responsibility, a moral obligation. We want this to go on forever. It needs to be sustainable. It needs to be there for future generations. So that everything we do, we think about it in that context.
And it has to be too, right? Because you would kill your own industry if you didn't.
Sustainability is every bit as important to my employer as it is to anybody else, because
Hmm.
our business relies on the biological entity on wood. If it's not there, we don't have a business. So we are focused on sustainable outcomes and ensuring that it's there today and in the future. And that's what I spend a lot of my time working on, and focusing on things that are affecting sustainability. There's a lot of externalities, again, going back to climate change and wildfire and other disturbance agents that are happening, and we're looking at what can we do, what do we need to do differently to adapt to those pressures and those things that are influencing the state of our forests.
What is the paramount challenge? What is the number one challenge facing forestry?
I break it into biophysical challenges and, again, climate change and the effects of climate change, which we're largely experiencing through wildfire. And we've spent a lot of time, I've spent a lot of time with some of the world's leading experts in this field, and fire ecology and landscape level ecology, and it's a fascinating area of science, and learning about where we're at in Canada, and in particular in Western Canada, and the state of our forests. And unintentionally, we've created some challenging conditions for ourselves, and they've been exacerbated by climate change pressures. But
How so? What do you mean unintentionally we created problems for ourselves?
we've put fires out for a long time in our forest, and we've done that for a number of reasons. Partly to protect timber values and maintain timber values, but also to protect other values. And at one time, fire in general was viewed as being bad, and no matter what, we needed to put it out. Now we can see that we've created some unnatural conditions in our forests where we've got very significant buildups of fuels, of dead organic materials. And when fire happens in those forests, it is very intense and typically very large fires that are very difficult to fight. And when the fire occurs, we get a very extensive and very complete burn. And the fires are larger than what we might have otherwise experienced. We're starting to understand that I think we have a stewardship responsibility to reassess, and we are reassessing, and we have been for some time. When I say we, I mean, that government, the sector as a whole.
Hmm.
We've evolved through a land use planning regime of fairly static designations and processes. So we sit down at the table, and you might come to the table and you say, well, I want this area for recreation. And I might come to the table and I might say, well, I want this area for something else. And someone might say, well, I want that area for timber production, and I want that area for wildlife, and so on. And I want that area to be protected. I don't want anybody to go there. And then we draw the polygons on the map and we say, okay, is everybody happy or adequately dissatisfied? Now
Hmm.
let's go do it. And we've been stuck with these designations for decades. But the forest has continued to change over time, even though we've put fires out. And now the person that wanted the recreation or the wildlife habitat or the timber, uh, everybody's quite unhappy because now no one really got what they wanted, and resilience is not there. It's failing us. So we've got to take another look and say, okay,
Yeah.
what forestry tools can we use to start to restore resilience, enhance these values, whether it's old forest or biodiversity or wildlife habitat? It doesn't mean we're going to log
Mm-hmm.
our way out of a problem, but there's things we can do for thinning, for using dead wood and other materials and reducing fire risk. So I think that's a really big one. That's a huge challenge for us. The other piece to that is a sort of the socio-political dimension where, again, we're on a public land base and we've got these land use plans. They're very significant plans. We need to find a way to reopen
Mm-hmm.
those plans and reinitiate those discussions. And that's really daunting and really challenging. And there's fear of very competing viewpoints and interests where on one extreme people might say, you screwed it up, you need to just leave it alone. And on the other extreme, people might say, you've got to get to work and manage all of this today. And the solution's probably somewhere in between. That aspect is really intensive. So it's not just an ecological or biological problem that we're facing. It's also a social problem. There's social science involved, and it takes a lot of expertise, bench strength, depth, and knowledge to work through this. And it would be different if it was just one community or one region or one province, but this is largely a Canada-wide challenge that we're
Yeah.
facing. And at
Yeah.
a scale where we are, I think, coming up a bit short on the available expertise and folks that we need to help us. So where do we start? How do we get this right? This is the stuff that I think about when someone says what's paramount, because it affects everything. It affects all forest values. It affects things that are of interest to a timber producer, someone that relies on the forest to make forest products, to someone who depends on the forest for their drinking water, to someone who depends on the forest as a main place of recreation. It affects all of us. And so, that's the paramount challenge. How do we, and we'll know, I think that we're on the right track when we're seeing the size and the intensity of these wildfires start to trend downwards.
You must be thinking, over the course of decades. Like it seems like everything is so broad in
Mm-hmm.
scope in your job.
I think it will take decades to curb the trend that we're experiencing today. I do think it's possible, but if you talk to the experts, the landscape fire ecologists, the PhDs, the folks that are studying this stuff day in and day out, they'll say that we have a limited amount of time because of climate change and the feedback mechanisms. Time is not on our side. We need to get to work.
Yeah, that's a big statement there to think about, that we need to get the fires under control before they're uncontrollable.
Yeah, and it's not going to be through fire suppression. It's going to be changing the attributes and the compositions of our forests so that we can live with fire. That's the key, is we have to be able to live with fire. When fire comes, we have to be able to allow it to be there, but also to be able to control or curb where it occurs and the intensity that we're experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
But to think that we could put fires out, I think we're beyond that. We know we can't. We can put 97% of the fire starts out and 3% can burn a huge amount of area.
Who decides whether or not to put it out?
We participate and work cooperatively with government in that space, and we're all working together. Government takes the lead in the firefighting. In British Columbia, for example, we have the wildfire service, but we work with them, we support them. We have our contractors, harvesting and road building contractors, have mobile equipment that can be used in firefighting activities. So we'll participate in coordinating those folks and assisting. If we start a fire on one of our active sites, we have full responsibility to action the fire and put the fire out. Luckily, that's a very rare circumstance.
Do you mean start a fire, like an incident of some kind? And
Yeah,
yeah, okay.
we have very stringent operating rules whereby as fire hazard increases, we'll scale back and shut down
Right.
to manage that risk. But yeah, so typically it's government takes the lead on that, but but we do participate and we support them. And then we also participate in the different projects that are happening in terms of assessing opportunities to reduce wildfire risk and different forest management regimes. And in British Columbia today, there's forest landscape planning processes underway, which is one of those sustainable forest management planning, falls in that bucket basically. And within the scope of those forest landscape plans, a big piece is looking at wildfire resilience, restoring resilience and modifying management regimes to improve those circumstances. And we're participating in those projects as well.
I think there's very few parts of Canada that doesn't have wildfires top of mind every year. So it's great to know that there's a plan moving forward, and always fascinating to think of the idea of this problem, and then the solution is to figure out how to live with it and understand it as a part of the forest cycle rather than just trying to snuff it out.
Fire is so inherent to our forests and our forest ecosystems, and more prescribed fire and cultural burning and so on is also part of the solution. A future without smoke is probably not realistic, but it's just more what kind of smoke do we want and when do we want it. I think we can influence that.
Smoke exists, but maybe not the smoke that blots out the sun for a month at a time,
and
something
the smoke
like that, right?
Yeah, is makes it hard to breathe for months on end in the summertime. We don't want any more of that.
Nobody does. I mean, that has ramifications across tourism industries, across, you name it, all over the place, just beyond quality of life.
Yeah.
I hear the term forest certification. What does that mean?
Well, so forest certification in Canada is something that's voluntary. It's an independent decision of forest companies to, really to demonstrate sustainable forest management practices, and it's something that we can provide to our customers and our investors, but also that we can show to the public as well. That is another verification of sustainable forest management practices. So, a lot of Canada's forests are certified. I think we lead the world actually in forest certification. Yeah, it's really a verification, like I say, to the public and our customers of sustainable practices that are being verified through third-party organizations. So, one of the main certifying entities is the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, SFI, and they have objectives, they have standards, and address things like the stuff we're talking about around. There's objectives for managing for fire, for example. We then need to create systems and demonstrate processes and outcomes that then get audited, and then they come in and do that work and say, okay, you're either meeting the standard or you're not, or there's an opportunity for improvement in your system. You have a deficiency here. Here's how you can get better. So it's also a continuous improvement system. It's never good enough. We can always do better, and we're always looking for ways to do better. So certification is all of that. I think it's quite interesting because it's another thing that in my career wasn't something that was very prominent or really there at the beginning. And it came along and we looked at it and said, we should do this, and started down the path. And it's just another demonstration of compliance and sustainable practices.
I wanted to circle back on one other aspect that we touched on earlier in the 4 buckets, and that's the cultural aspect. How do you work with Indigenous communities in Canada?
I think Indigenous people comprise roughly 5% of Canada's population, but the majority, over 70%, live either in or near the forest. So, we work a lot with Indigenous people and Indigenous communities, and they have a lot of interaction with the forest and with the natural environment in general. And understanding, like, we learn a lot by working with them and understanding their perspectives on sustainable forest management and helping make sure that they're informing that and working together with us. So, I think in Western Canada alone, we're engaging with over 100 Indigenous communities that, have territory in our areas of operations. And we're working with them in many different ways, supporting things that are, I think, aligned well with reconciliation and particularly economic reconciliation. So we're procuring services from Indigenous-owned businesses. We're supporting Indigenous people through employment opportunities with our different operations and always looking for ways to do more of that and assessing ourselves and, saying, what would it take to increase the number of Indigenous people working with us? And so it's everything from community engagement, participating in community events and being part of the community, supporting their communities. It could be, attending powwows. It could be any number of things. And then learning from them as well, spending time together in the forest, supporting their opportunity to be part of the economic aspects of our business. So it's very multifaceted, our engagement and our relationship building with Indigenous communities. It's another area that, again, through my career has really grown a lot. Like it's something that really in the last probably 2 decades in particular, we've put a lot more emphasis and we've become much more aware than what we may have been 30 years ago.
It must be very enriching to work with these communities and share knowledge and share opportunities.
That's the story that is unfolding at scale, like a lot more Indigenous people becoming involved in forestry. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for Indigenous-led forest management, Indigenous communities holding forest tenure and being part of forestry businesses, owning forestry businesses. There's a lot of positive synergies to be realized. And, I think we're just scratching the surface right now.
So scratching the surface, opportunities arising. What is your vision of the future forest?
My vision of the future forest would be a healthy forest where things are in balance and where people can be proud of the forests that they have, the public forest lands that we have, that they can look at the forest and have a sense of satisfaction that rather than despair. If you look at tens of thousands of hectares of burnt landscape or landscape that's been impacted by insect infestations, whether it's bark beetle or some other insect, or something else that's affecting the health, the condition of our forests. In the future, I want to see healthy green forests of multiple ages. I want to see diverse landscapes. I want to see sustainable, healthy businesses in our communities that are confident in the resource and making investments, and people employed in long-term meaningful jobs. I want to see Indigenous people employed and realizing the benefits of those opportunities, but at the same time being able to exercise their traditional rights and cultural uses in those forests. I think we can achieve it all.
That's great to hear. And definitely your passion and enthusiasm and optimism is making me feel the same way. So I love to know that there are people out there like you in our forestry sector that care that much about our future forests. But Jeff, super fascinating to talk to you today. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you'd like to tell our listeners?
One thing I would say is there's a lot of great resources out there. If people are curious or want to look into more, they can go to forestryforthefuture.ca, all one word, and there's a lot of great information on that website.
Yes, I spent some time on that website before our interview, and it's a beautiful site. It's a very, very rich site. So I'll link to that from explore-mag.com. Jeff, again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and passion and enthusiasm with us today. It was very interesting.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. Nice to spend an hour with you.
Wow, lots to dig into. A lot of moving pieces and considerations. Personally, I'm glad to know there are people like Jeff, people who truly care about the health of our forests, overseeing forest management and forestry. It can be a tough thing sometimes to look at a harvested forest, but I hope this interview has provided you with some insight into how, why, when, and where forestry activity takes place, and how we replenish our forests so our children and grandchildren can have the same experiences we enjoy, tromping under dense canopies of evergreens, exploring, and just being wild. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm David Webb, and hey, live the adventure.